girl stood beside the sea while tears rolled down her face. Behind her, chains rattled softly in the darkness. Ahead of her, the ocean stretched endlessly beneath the burning sun. She did not know that one day her voice would travel across the world and shake powerful men sitting inside grand buildings in England. She did not know that her pain, her memories, and her courage would become one of the strongest weapons against slavery ever written. But before the world knew her name, Mary Prince was simply a frightened child trying to survive in a world built on fear. Before we begin this unforgettable story, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who loves powerful true stories from history. Do not forget to leave a comment at the end telling us what you learned from this emotional journey. The island of Bermuda looked peaceful to strangers. The sea sparkled beautifully beneath the morning sun. Birds flew across the bright sky, and fishing boats drifted quietly over calm blue water. Wealthy visitors arriving on the island often admired its beauty. They smiled at the colorful houses and the warm breeze flowing through the narrow streets. But hidden behind that beauty was another world, a world built on fear, suffering, and silence. In that hidden world lived a little girl named Mary Prince. Mary was born into slavery during the late 1700s. Before she learned how to read, before she learned how dangerous life could become, she already belonged to someone else. Her future, her body, and even her family were controlled by people who believed enslaved lives existed only for labor and profit. Mary's earliest memories were filled with fear hiding quietly inside everyday life. She remembered waking up before sunrise beside her mother and sisters. She remembered hearing tired footsteps moving across wooden floors, while the sky outside still looked dark. Her mother worked constantly. She cooked, cleaned, carried water, washed clothes, and obeyed endless commands from slave owners. Mary often watched her mother's face carefully. Even while smiling at her children, sadness always seemed to hide behind her eyes. Her father worked hard too. He moved carefully whenever white owners appeared nearby. He spoke softly and avoided direct eye contact, because one wrong word could bring punishment. As a child, Mary could not fully understand why adults around her behaved with such fear, but she felt it everywhere. Fear lived inside the walls of every home. Fear traveled through every whispered conversation. Fear followed every enslaved person like a shadow. At night, Mary sometimes woke up and heard her mother crying quietly in darkness. The sound confused and frightened her. One evening, she finally asked why she cried so often. Her mother pulled Mary close and kissed her forehead gently. "Because this world can take everything from us," she whispered. Mary did not fully understand those words then. She still believed families stayed together forever. She still believed mothers could protect their children from harm. But very soon, life would destroy those innocent beliefs completely. One hot afternoon, the sound of horses and wagon wheels echoed through the street outside their home. Several slave owners arrived carrying papers in their hands. Mary immediately noticed fear spreading across her mother's face. The woman's hands began trembling badly while she gathered the children close beside her. The atmosphere changed instantly. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody spoke loudly. Even the air itself felt heavy. Mary watched the owners pointing toward enslaved families while discussing prices casually. One man walked directly toward Mary and her sisters. He looked at them carefully, like a merchant examining animals at a market. He touched Mary's arm without asking permission, while speaking quietly to another man nearby. Mary felt deeply uncomfortable. Why were strangers touching her? Why did her mother look terrified? Then the truth arrived like lightning. Mary and her sisters were being sold away. The news shattered the family instantly. Her mother fell onto her knees, crying uncontrollably while begging the men not to separate her children. Mary watched tears pouring down her mother's face while desperation filled her voice. "Please," her mother cried, "please do not take my babies." But the owners showed no compassion. To them, enslaved families were not real families. They were property. Profit mattered more than love. Mary screamed and held tightly onto her mother's dress while her sisters cried beside her. But strong hands pulled the children away roughly. Mary reached desperately toward her mother while being dragged toward the waiting wagon. Her mother screamed her name repeatedly. "Mary, Mary." The sound echoed painfully inside her heart. Even after the wagon started moving, Mary kept stretching her hands backward, as if somehow she could still reach her mother across the growing distance. That moment became one of the deepest wounds of her entire life. Mary sat trembling during the journey toward her new owners. Tears covered her face while fear twisted painfully inside her chest. She could still hear her mother's cries in her memory. She wondered whether she would ever see her family again. The answer frightened her, maybe not. When Mary arrived at her new home, childhood ended forever. She was still very young, but slavery did not allow children to remain children for long. Every morning, she woke before sunrise to begin working immediately. She household items and obeyed every command without delay. If she moved too slowly, she was shouted at. If she made mistakes, punishment followed. If she cried, nobody cared. The house felt cold and unfamiliar. Mary missed her mother constantly. At night, she sometimes whispered her mother's name softly into darkness while staring at the ceiling above her bed. Days slowly became months. Mary learned how slavery operated. She learned that survival depended on silence. Older enslaved women taught her important lessons quietly. Do not answer back. Do not show anger. Move quickly. Never let them see fear. Mary listened carefully because she understood punishment could arrive suddenly at any moment. One morning while cleaning, Mary accidentally dropped a household object onto the floor. The crash echoed loudly through the room. Fear instantly rushed through her body. Before she could apologize properly, her owner stormed into the room filled with rage. The beating came quickly. Pain exploded across Mary's shoulders and back. She collapsed onto the floor, trembling while tears streamed down her face. That night, she lay awake, crying silently into her blanket. For the first time, she truly understood something terrible. Even children were not safe in slavery. As the years passed, Mary grew physically stronger, but emotionally she carried growing sadness inside her heart. She witnessed suffering constantly around her. She saw exhausted women continue working while sick. She watched enslaved men punished publicly to frighten others. She heard stories about children sold away forever from their parents. Fear controlled everything. Yet despite the cruelty surrounding her, Mary also witnessed hidden moments of humanity among enslaved people. At night, women comforted frightened children with songs and prayers. Workers secretly shared food with hungry neighbors. Families gathered quietly to support each other emotionally after punishments. Those moments mattered deeply because they reminded Mary that dignity could survive even in terrible conditions. One stormy evening, Mary sat beside an elderly enslaved woman named Sarah while rain crashed loudly outside. Sarah looked toward the dark window thoughtfully. "One day, slavery will end," she whispered softly. Mary stared at her with surprise. "How can that happen?" she asked. Sarah smiled sadly, because evil never lasts forever. Mary never forgot those words. Still, daily life remained brutally difficult. Mary worked endlessly from sunrise until late evening nearly every day. Her hands became rough from labor. Her body often ached badly from exhaustion. Sometimes she felt so tired that she could barely remain awake during dinner. But emotional pain hurt even more. She missed her family constantly. Every time she saw mothers holding children close, sadness filled her chest. Would her mother still recognize her face? Were her sisters alive somewhere on the island? Those painful questions followed Mary everywhere. As Mary entered her teenage years, she became more aware of the cruelty surrounding her. She noticed how slave owners treated enslaved people as property instead of human beings. Some owners behaved politely in public while becoming cruel privately. Others openly enjoyed humiliating enslaved workers. One afternoon, Mary witnessed something horrifying. A young enslaved boy tried visiting his mother on another property without permission. When he returned, the overseer punished him publicly before everyone else. The boy cried desperately while begging for mercy. Mary felt sick watching the scene unfold. The child only wanted to see his mother. Yet slavery treated love itself like a crime. That moment changed something inside Mary permanently. She realized slavery attacked more than bodies. It destroyed families. It destroyed hope. It destroyed dignity. At night, Mary often stared toward the endless ocean surrounding Bermuda. The sea looked beautiful beneath moonlight, but to Mary, it also represented mystery. What existed beyond the water? Could freedom exist somewhere far away? Could life ever become different? Those dangerous thoughts slowly grew stronger inside her heart. Around this time, Mary was sold again. Each sale felt like losing another piece of herself. New owners meant new fears, new rules, and new uncertainty. Some households relied on constant shouting and punishment. Others controlled enslaved workers through emotional cruelty and threats. Mary quickly learned slavery could wear many different faces. During one period, she worked under an owner known for violent anger. Everyone inside the house feared his moods because rage could explode suddenly without warning. One evening, he accused an enslaved woman of working too slowly. The woman apologized repeatedly while trembling with fear, but the owner ignored her tears completely. Mary watched helplessly while punishment followed. That night, the enslaved workers gathered quietly afterward. Nobody spoke loudly. The injured woman cried softly, while another worker cleaned her wounds carefully. Mary sat silently nearby, feeling helpless anger burning inside her chest. Why did some people enjoy controlling others through fear? Why did the world allow such cruelty? No answers came, but Mary remembered everything, every insult, every cry, every moment of injustice. Without realizing it fully, she was slowly collecting memories that would one day shake an empire. As Mary matured, owners praised her hard-working spirit because she completed tasks carefully and efficiently. But hard-working enslaved people were rarely rewarded with kindness. Instead, they usually received even more labor. Mary carried heavy loads beneath the Caribbean heat for endless hours. She washed mountains of clothing until her hands hurt badly. She scrubbed floors and cleaned kitchens from sunrise until darkness covered the island. Some days, exhaustion overwhelmed her completely. Yet inside Mary, something refused to die. A quiet strength continued growing. She noticed small forms of resistance among enslaved communities. People secretly shared stories. They comforted each other emotionally. They protected frightened children. These hidden acts of humanity mattered deeply because they reminded enslaved people they were still human despite everything slavery tried to destroy. One Sunday afternoon, Mary attended a religious gathering beside several other enslaved workers. The preacher spoke about justice and dignity before God. Mary listened carefully while emotion filled her chest. The idea that every human life possessed value felt powerful because slavery constantly taught the opposite. After the gathering, Mary walked slowly home beside another young enslaved girl. "Do you think freedom will ever come?" the girl asked quietly. Mary looked toward the distant sea thoughtfully. "I do not know," she answered honestly, "but people should never stop hoping." Those words surprised even Mary herself. Hope had become dangerous because disappointment followed so often, yet somewhere deep inside, she still believed life could change. Months later, Mary overheard sailors discussing anti-slavery voices growing louder in England. The conversation captured her full attention. Some people across the ocean believed slavery was evil. Some questioned whether human beings should ever own other human beings. The idea felt almost impossible. For so long, Mary assumed powerful people everywhere accepted slavery completely. Now she realized opposition existed beyond the islands. That knowledge planted something new inside her heart possibility. Though her own life remained controlled by others, Mary no longer believed suffering would stay hidden forever. One evening, while sitting alone outside after work, Mary thought about her mother again. She tried remembering every detail of her face, because time slowly blurred old memories. Would they ever meet again? Did her mother still think about her every night? The uncertainty hurt terribly. But beneath the fading evening sky, Mary made a silent promise to herself. If she ever escaped slavery's control, she would never allow the world to ignore what enslaved people suffered. She would speak, she would remember, she would tell the truth. At that moment, Mary could not possibly imagine how far her voice would someday travel. The frightened little girl, once torn away from her family, would eventually become one of the strongest voices against slavery in the British Empire. But before that future arrived, darker struggles still waited ahead. Soon Mary would leave Bermuda behind forever. Soon she would enter the burning salt fields of Antigua, where survival itself would become a daily battle beneath the merciless Caribbean sun. The ship carrying Mary Prince across the Caribbean waters rocked violently beneath dark clouds, while waves crashed against the wooden sides like angry fists. Mary sat silently near the edge of the crowded vessel, staring toward the endless sea, with fear growing heavily inside her chest. Bermuda was slowly disappearing behind her. Everything familiar was fading into the distance. She did not know exactly what waited ahead in Antigua, but something deep inside warned her that life was about to become even harder. The air smelled of salt, sweat, and sickness. Enslaved workers sat quietly around the ship, while sailors shouted orders above them. Some people cried softly during the journey. Others remained completely silent, as if fear had stolen every word from their mouths. Mary wrapped her arms around herself while cold wind struck her face. She felt completely alone. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction like a prison with no walls. One elderly woman sitting nearby noticed Mary's frightened expression. "Where are they taking us?" Mary asked softly. The woman lowered her eyes before answering. "To Antigua," she whispered. "The salt ponds." The word sent fear rushing through Mary immediately. She had heard stories about the salt ponds before, stories about endless labor beneath burning heat, stories about bodies collapsing from exhaustion, stories about skin cracking open from salt and sunlight. Stories about people growing sick and weak before dying, slowly. Mary tried not to panic, but her hands began trembling badly. For the rest of the journey, she barely spoke. At night, she stared upward toward the dark sky while the ship moved through restless waters. She wondered whether her mother was still alive somewhere in Bermuda. She wondered whether she herself would survive whatever waited ahead in Antigua. Days later, the island finally appeared across the horizon. At first, Antigua looked beautiful beneath the bright Caribbean sun. Palm trees moved gently in the warm breeze, while colorful buildings stood near the shoreline. Wealthy visitors arriving there often admired the island's beauty, but enslaved people saw something else entirely. Mary saw another prison. The moment she stepped onto the island, heavy heat wrapped around her body like fire. The air itself felt hotter than Bermuda. Sweat quickly covered her skin, while exhaustion settled deeply into her bones. Overseers shouted commands immediately after arrival. Workers moved quickly, carrying supplies, while horses pulled wagons across dusty roads. Mary looked around nervously at the unfamiliar faces surrounding her. Everything felt dangerous. Everything felt uncertain. Soon Mary learned the terrible truth. She had been sent to labor in the salt fields, the first morning that began before sunrise. Mary woke while darkness still covered the island. Workers gathered silently near the salt ponds, while overseers walked nearby carrying whips and shouting impatiently. Mary stared toward the endless white fields stretching beneath the growing morning light. The sight shocked her. Huge mountains of bright salt covered the ground like snow beneath the blazing Caribbean sun. The white surface reflected light so intensely that Mary's eyes hurt almost immediately. One older worker standing nearby spoke quietly, without looking directly at her. "Do not fall behind," he warned. "They punish weakness here." Fear tightened inside Mary's chest. Moments later, labor began. Workers lifted heavy baskets filled with salt and carried them across the burning fields repeatedly for endless hours. The work destroyed the body slowly. Salt cut into bare feet. The reflected sunlight burned skin and eyes constantly. Heavy loads crushed shoulders and backs. Within only a few hours, Mary already felt completely exhausted. Sweat poured down her face. Her muscles screamed painfully. The heat became unbearable. Still, the overseers shouted constantly, "Move faster. No resting. Keep working." Anyone slowing down received threats immediately. Mary forced herself forward again and again, despite terrible pain spreading through her body. By midday, the sun felt merciless. The bright salt reflected heat directly upward, while the Caribbean sky burned above them without mercy. Mary's hands became swollen and raw from carrying rough baskets repeatedly. Salt entered tiny cuts across her skin, causing sharp burning pain. Some workers coughed badly while struggling to continue. Others limped from exhaustion. Yet nobody dared stop. One woman near Mary suddenly collapsed onto the ground while carrying a heavy basket. The load spilled across the white field beside her. Mary froze in fear. The woman struggled weakly while trying to breathe properly. Instead of helping her immediately, the overseer stormed toward her furiously. "Lazy woman," he shouted. The exhausted worker tried explaining she felt dizzy, but the overseer refused to listen. Mary watched helplessly while punishment followed. Fear spread silently across the workers nearby. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The message was clear. Pain did not matter. Exhaustion did not matter. Only labor mattered. That evening, Mary returned to the small, crowded shelter where enslaved workers slept together. Her entire body ached terribly. She could barely lift her arms properly. An older woman sitting nearby noticed Mary trembling while trying to clean salt from her wounded hands. "You are new," the woman said quietly. Mary nodded weakly. The woman sighed sadly. "The salt fields break people slowly," she whispered. Mary looked around the shelter carefully. For the first time, she truly noticed the condition of many workers there. Some suffered swollen joints. Others coughed constantly. Several older workers struggled to walk properly. Years of brutal labor had damaged their bodies permanently. Fear settled heavily inside Mary again. Would this become her future too? The next morning, the labor continued exactly the same, and the morning after that, and the next. Days slowly turned into weeks. Weeks became months. Mary's body suffered terribly beneath the endless work. Her skin cracked painfully from constant exposure to salt and sunlight. Her hands became rough and swollen. Sharp pain spread through her legs and back daily. Sometimes exhaustion became so overwhelming, she feared collapsing beside the other workers. Yet somehow she kept surviving. At night, workers often gathered quietly together after overseers disappeared. Those secret conversations became the only moments of comfort during terrible days. People shared stories softly in darkness. They prayed together. They comforted the sick. They mourned friends who disappeared or died. One evening, Mary sat beside an elderly worker named Ruth, while rain tapped softly against the roof above them. Ruth studied Mary's exhausted face carefully. "You must protect your spirit," she whispered. Mary looked confused. "How?" Ruth smiled sadly. "Because they work hard to break more than your body here." Those words stayed inside Mary's mind afterward. Slavery truly attacked more than flesh and bones. It attacked identity. It attacked hope. It attacked the human spirit itself. Still, despite everything, small acts of humanity continued surviving among enslaved people. Workers secretly shared food with those too sick to eat properly. Surviving among enslaved people. Workers secretly shared food with those too sick to eat properly. Women comforted frightened children. Men quietly helped injured workers carry heavier loads. Those hidden acts of kindness mattered deeply because they reminded people they were still human. One afternoon, Mary noticed a young girl struggling to carry an overloaded basket through the blazing heat. The child looked terrified and exhausted. Without hesitation, Mary quietly helped carry part of the load herself. The overseer noticed briefly, but said nothing, because labor continued moving quickly. Later that evening, the girl whispered softly, "Thank you." The simple words touched Mary deeply. In a world built on cruelty, kindness became a form of resistance. As months passed, Mary became increasingly respected among fellow workers because of her strength and compassion. She encouraged frightened newcomers and comforted sick women whenever possible. Yet her own body continued weakening. Persistent pain spread through her joints constantly. Some mornings, she struggled even to stand properly after sleeping. Sharp aches moved through her back and legs, while exhaustion settled permanently inside her body. One older worker examined Mary's swollen hands one evening and shook his head sadly. "The salt is destroying you," he whispered. Mary looked away silently. Deep inside, she already knew he was right. Still, the work never stopped. Every sunrise brought another brutal day beneath the blazing Caribbean sun. One afternoon, a violent storm suddenly swept across Antigua, while workers remained trapped in the fields. Rain crashed heavily against the white salt ponds, while strong wind nearly knocked people down. while carrying a heavy basket and crashed painfully onto the rough ground. Sharp pain shot through her leg immediately. For several terrifying moments she could not stand. Rain poured across her face while fear consumed her thoughts. If she could not work, what would happen to her? Would punishment follow? Would they abandon her completely? Then suddenly strong hands grabbed her arm. It was Ruth. The older woman helped pull Mary upright before whispering urgently, "Move, quickly." Together, they continued struggling through the storm, while thunder exploded overhead. That night, Mary sat trembling inside the shelter, while pain spread through her injured leg. Ruth handed her a cloth quietly. "You cannot trust this place," Ruth whispered softly. "The moment your body fails, they stop seeing value in you." Mary understood exactly what she meant. Enslaved workers were treated like tools. Once broken, they became disposable. The realization terrified her deeply. As the years continued passing, Mary's chronic illness worsened. Constant labor beneath brutal conditions damaged her body permanently. She suffered severe pain and weakness regularly. Sometimes even breathing felt difficult after long days beneath the sun. Yet emotionally, something unexpected was happening inside her. Her suffering was sharpening her understanding of slavery itself. She began noticing how the system depended completely on silence. Owners wanted the outside world believing plantations were orderly and civilized. They wanted people across the ocean imagining enslaved workers were treated kindly. But Mary knew the truth. The truth lived inside scars, exhaustion, broken families, and silent tears hidden beneath Caribbean nights. One evening, sailors visited Antigua while drinking and speaking loudly near the docks. Mary overheard part of their conversation while working nearby. Some people in England were openly speaking against slavery. Some activists wanted stories directly from enslaved workers themselves. Mary listened carefully while her heart pounded. Stories, truth, voices. The idea stayed inside her thoughts long afterward. What if the world actually heard what happened inside places like the salt fields? What if powerful people finally understood the suffering hidden behind plantation wealth? That possibility felt dangerous but powerful. One night, Mary sat alone outside beneath the moonlight, while warm Caribbean wind moved gently across the island. She thought about her mother. She thought about Bermuda. She thought about every exhausted worker sleeping nearby after another brutal day. Then slowly a quiet promise formed inside her heart. If she ever escaped this life, she would speak. She would tell the truth no matter how uncomfortable it made powerful people feel. She would not allow the suffering around her to remain hidden forever. At that moment, Mary still did not understand how important her future voice would become. She only knew silence protected cruelty, and deep inside her growing pain and exhaustion, a dangerous strength was beginning to rise. But even greater emotional storms waited ahead, because soon Mary's heart would discover love in the middle of slavery, and that love would bring both hope and heartbreak in ways she never expected. The years passed slowly in Antigua, but the suffering inside the salt fields never became easier. Every morning, Mary Prince woke before sunrise with pain already waiting inside her body. Her joints ached constantly, her hands remained swollen from endless labor, and sharp weakness moved through her legs whenever she carried heavy salt baskets beneath the burning Caribbean sun. Still, Mary survived. Many people around her did not. Some workers disappeared after illness became too severe. Others collapsed from exhaustion and never returned to the fields again. Death moved quietly through plantation life like an invisible shadow. Everyone feared it, Yet nobody had time to stop and mourn properly, because labor never ended. One evening, after another brutal day beneath the blazing heat, Mary sat outside the workers' shelter, rubbing her aching hands slowly. The sky above Antigua glowed orange while the sun disappeared behind distant hills. Around her, exhausted workers rested quietly after hours of punishment from both labor and overseers. Mary closed her eyes for a moment, trying to ignore the pain spreading through her body. Then she heard a voice nearby. "You should not sit alone every evening." Mary opened her eyes carefully. A man stood beside the shelter carrying wooden tools across one shoulder. He looked strong and calm, with thoughtful eyes that seemed different from most men Mary knew on the plantation. His name was Daniel James. Daniel worked as a cooper, building and repairing barrels used across the island. Unlike many enslaved workers trapped completely inside plantation labor, Daniel sometimes traveled between properties because of his skills. He had seen more of Antigua than most people around them. Mary studied him carefully before speaking. "Sometimes silence feels easier," she answered softly. Daniel smiled slightly. "Silence can become dangerous too." The word surprised her. Most people avoided deep conversations because fear controlled everyday life under slavery. But something about Daniel felt different. He carried sadness inside him like everyone else, yet he also carried quiet confidence. Over the following weeks, they began speaking more often during evenings after work ended. Sometimes they sat near the edge of the property, watching moonlight reflect across distant water. Other times they walked slowly beside narrow roads while keeping careful watch for overseers nearby. For the first time in many years, Mary felt something warm growing inside her heart, hope. Daniel listened carefully whenever she spoke. He treated her like a real person instead of property. He asked about her childhood in Bermuda, her mother, and the years she survived inside the salt fields. Nobody had asked about her feelings in a very long time. One evening, Mary finally told Daniel about the day she was sold away from her mother. Her voice trembled while describing the wagon pulling her father away as her mother screamed desperately behind her. Daniel remained silent for several moments afterward. Then quietly he reached for her hand. "No child should suffer that," he whispered. Mary looked away quickly because tears were already filling her eyes. The gentleness in his voice frightened her almost as much as cruelty once had, because kindness created attachment, and attachment became dangerous in slavery. Still, Mary could not stop herself from growing closer to him. During long, painful days in the salt fields, thoughts of Daniel gave her strength. She found herself looking forward to evenings again despite exhaustion. Even her laughter slowly returned in small moments. Other workers noticed the growing connection between them. Some smiled warmly, others looked worried. An older woman named Ruth finally spoke to Mary privately one night. "You must be careful," Ruth warned quietly. Mary frowned slightly. "Why?" Ruth sighed heavily. "Because slavery hates love. Love gives people strength. Owners do not like strength they cannot control." Those words stayed inside Mary's mind afterward. Yet despite the warning, her feelings for Daniel only grew stronger. One evening, while sitting beneath the stars, Daniel spoke softly about freedom. "Sometimes I dream about leaving Antigua forever," he admitted. Mary looked at him carefully. "Where would you go?" "Anywhere," he answered quietly. "Anywhere a person can wake up without fear." The sadness in his voice touched her deep. For several moments neither spoke. Then Daniel looked directly into her eyes. "You deserve freedom too, Mary." Those simple words shook something inside her heart. Nobody had ever spoken to her that way before, not as property, not as labor, but as someone deserving dignity and peace. From that moment, their bond became impossible to ignore. They spent every possible moment together, despite growing risks. Plantation owners disliked enslaved people forming strong emotional connections because love created loyalty beyond the system's control. Still, Mary and Daniel continued seeing each other secretly. One warm evening, Daniel took Mary near the shoreline after sunset. Waves crashed softly against rocks, while moonlight reflected beautifully across the water. For a brief moment, the world felt peaceful. Daniel turned toward her slowly. "I want us to build a life together," he whispered. Mary's heart began racing immediately. "A real life," he continued softly, "even if slavery tries to stop us." Tears filled Mary's eyes again. No one had ever offered her dreams before. Only commands, only labor, only survival. But now this man stood before her, speaking about love and possibility beneath the Caribbean night sky. Mary nodded slowly, while emotion overwhelmed her chest. "Yes," she whispered. Their relationship soon became known across parts of the plantation. Some workers quietly celebrated the happiness growing between them because joy was rare inside slavery. But the owners reacted differently. Mary quickly noticed tension increasing around her. Overseers watched her more closely. Household workers whispered warnings. One afternoon, her owner called her inside the main house unexpectedly. The woman stared coldly at Mary before speaking. "I hear you spend too much time with that Cooper," she said sharply. Mary lowered her eyes carefully. "We only speak sometimes." The owner laughed bitterly. "Do not lie to me." Fear tightened inside Mary's chest. The woman stepped closer. "You belong here," she continued harshly. "Do not forget that." Mary remained silent because she understood answering incorrectly could bring punishment immediately. But inside, anger slowly burned. Why should slavery control love too? Why should even human connection belong to owners? That evening, Mary told Daniel about the conversation. He looked deeply troubled. "They will try separating us," he warned quietly. Mary's chest tightened painfully. "No," she whispered. "Please, no." Daniel held her hands gently. "Listen to me," he said softly. "Whatever happens, remember you are more than what they call you." Those words stayed with her afterward. Weeks later, Daniel proposed marriage despite growing opposition around them. The decision frightened Mary deeply because marriage under slavery carried no real protection. Owners could still separate couples at any moment through sale or punishment. Yet despite the danger, Mary agreed. The ceremony happened quietly among friends and supportive workers. There were no grand decorations or wealthy guests. But for Mary, the moment felt more meaningful than anything she had ever experienced. For the first time since childhood, she felt seen as a human being deserving love. As she stood beside Daniel during the simple ceremony, emotion flooded her chest powerfully. She thought about her mother. She thought about every painful year surviving alone. She thought about how impossible happiness once seemed. Now here she stood holding someone's hand, not because owners demanded it, but because love brought them together willingly. For one brief moment, slavery felt far away. But peace never lasted long inside plantation life. Soon after the marriage, tensions with Mary's owners became much worse. They disliked her independence growing stronger through the relationship. They disliked seeing her emotionally connected to someone outside their control. Punishments increased subtly at first. more labor, harsher treatment, constant surveillance. Mary noticed overseers watching her movements constantly whenever Daniel visited nearby. One afternoon, she requested permission to spend more time living with her husband. The response came quickly. No. The single word crushed her emotionally. Mary returned to the workers' quarters fighting tears desperately. How could marriage exist without freedom? How could love survive constant control? That evening, Daniel found her crying quietly outside. They want to break us, she whispered painfully. Daniel wrapped his arms around her carefully. Then we cannot let them. But fear already surrounded them both. Rumors spread across the plantation about possible sales and transfers. Every enslaved family feared separation because it happened constantly throughout the Caribbean. One morning, Mary witnessed another enslaved woman screaming desperately while her husband was dragged toward a wagon after being sold away. The woman collapsed onto the ground crying uncontrollably while others stood silently nearby. Mary felt sick watching the scene. That could become her future too. That night, she could barely sleep. She stared into darkness, imagining Daniel disappearing forever, the same way her mother once disappeared from her life. The thought terrified her completely. Around this period, Mary's health also worsened significantly. Years inside the salt fields had damaged her body deeply. Persistent illness followed her constantly now. Some mornings she woke barely able to stand because pain spread through her legs and back so severely. Still, work continued. Slavery showed little concern for suffering. Mary forced herself through labor daily, despite weakness growing inside her body. Daniel worried constantly about her condition. "You need rest," he insisted one evening, while helping clean wounds across her swollen hands. Mary laughed bitterly. "Rest does not exist here." The sadness on Daniel's face broke her heart. Despite everything, their love continued growing stronger through shared suffering. They supported each other emotionally during difficult days. They prayed together quietly at night. They dreamed about freedom even when reality felt hopeless. One evening, Daniel spoke carefully after long silence. "We should escape." Mary stared at him in shock. Escape. The word itself felt dangerous. Captured fugitives often faced terrible punishment. Some never survived recapture at all. Yet another part of Mary understood why Daniel considered it. Remaining enslaved meant endless suffering too. Fear controlled every path. "What if they catch us?" Mary whispered. Daniel looked toward the dark horizon thoughtfully. "What if we stay?" he answered quietly. Neither spoke afterward, because both questions carried terrifying truth. Around this same period, abolitionist voices in England continued growing louder. Sailors and travelers occasionally carried rumors across the Caribbean about people openly challenging slavery. Mary listened carefully whenever such conversations happened nearby. For the first time in her life, freedom no longer felt completely impossible. Distant maybe, dangerous certainly, but possible. One afternoon, while resting briefly after labor, Mary overheard visitors discussing anti-slavery movements in England. "They want stories from enslaved people themselves," one man explained. "Real stories." The words captured Mary's attention instantly. Real stories. Who better understood slavery than those trapped inside it? That thought remained inside her mind long afterward. One night, while sitting beside Daniel beneath the moonlight, Mary spoke quietly. "If the world truly heard what happens here, maybe things could change." Daniel looked at her thoughtfully. "Then maybe one day you should tell them." Mary frowned slightly. "Who would listen to someone like me?" Daniel squeezed her hand gently. Anyone with a soul. Those simple words settled deeply inside her heart. Mary still did not fully understand it yet, but her voice was slowly becoming stronger than fear itself. And soon, destiny would carry her far beyond Antigua, toward a future neither she nor Daniel could possibly imagine. The morning Mary Prince learned she would leave Antigua forever began like every other painful morning on the island. The sky glowed orange above the Caribbean Sea, while exhausted workers prepared themselves for another brutal day of labor. Mary stood outside, quietly rubbing her aching hands together, while warm wind moved through the trees nearby. Her body felt weaker than ever. Years inside the salt fields had damaged her health badly. Pain followed her constantly now. Some mornings she woke barely able to stand properly, yet work always continued. That morning, an overseer suddenly approached her with sharp, hurried steps. "You are wanted at the house," he ordered coldly. Fear tightened inside Mary's chest immediately. Being called unexpectedly usually meant trouble. Mary followed silently, while nervous thoughts rushed through her mind. Had she broken some rule? Had someone reported her conversations with Daniel? Was punishment waiting? When she entered the main house, her owners sat speaking quietly together near the window. The atmosphere felt strange and tense. Finally, the woman looked directly at Mary. "We are leaving Antigua," she announced. Mary blinked slowly. Leaving. The word confused her completely. The owner continued speaking. "We are traveling to England. You will come with us." Mary felt the room spinning slightly around her. England. She had heard stories about England for years. A distant land across the ocean where cold winds blew through crowded streets and powerful people debated slavery openly. Some enslaved workers whispered that freedom felt closer there. Others warned that danger existed everywhere. Mary stood frozen, while emotions battled inside her chest. Fear, confusion, hope, and terrible sadness, because leaving Antigua also meant leaving Daniel behind. That evening, Mary found Daniel near the shoreline after sunset. The moment he saw her expression, concern filled his eyes immediately. "What happened?" Mary struggled to speak. "They are taking me away," she whispered. Daniel stared at her silently for several seconds. "Where?" "To England." The waves crashed softly behind them while silence settled heavily between them. Finally, Daniel looked away toward the dark ocean. "When?" "In a few days." Pain spread across Mary's chest as she watched his face tighten with emotion. For several moments neither spoke because the truth hurt too deeply. Slavery was separating them, again, just like it separated mothers from children, just like it destroyed countless families across the islands. Mary felt tears filling her eyes. "I do not want to leave you," she whispered painfully. Daniel stepped closer and held her gently. "I know." The sadness in his voice nearly broke her heart completely. During the following days, Mary moved through Antigua like someone trapped inside a terrible dream. Everywhere she looked reminded her of memories with Daniel. The shoreline where they shared quiet conversations beneath moonlight. The narrow roads where they walked together after work. The small hidden places where they allowed themselves moments of happiness, despite slavery surrounding them constantly. Now all of it was disappearing. Workers whispered sympathetically after hearing the news. Many understood exactly what Mary felt, because separation haunted every enslaved family. One older woman hugged Mary tightly before departure. "Do not forget who you are," she whispered softly. Mary nodded while fighting tears. The night before leaving Antigua, Mary and Daniel sat together beneath the stars one final time. Neither wanted the night to end. Warm wind moved gently around them, while distant waves crashed against rocks nearby. Daniel reached into his pocket slowly and removed a small piece of cloth folded carefully. "I want you to keep this," he said quietly. Mary unfolded it carefully. Inside rested a tiny shell from the shoreline where they first spoke together. Emotion overwhelmed her instantly. "Daniel," she whispered. "No matter how far away you go," he said softly, "remember someone loves you." Mary could no longer hold back tears. She wrapped her arms around him desperately, while sadness crushed her chest. "I will come back," she whispered through tears. Daniel closed his eyes tightly. "I pray you do." But deep inside, both feared they might never see each other again. The next morning, the ship waited near the harbour beneath grey skies. Sailors moved quickly across the deck, shouting orders while passengers prepared for departure. Mary stood near the dock, trembling badly. Daniel stood several feet away, because enslaved couples were rarely allowed emotional farewells publicly. Still, their eyes remained locked together. Neither wanted to let go. Finally, the order came to board. Mary climbed slowly onto the ship, while tears blurred her vision. She turned back one final time. Daniel stood motionless near the shoreline. The distance between them already felt unbearable. As the ship slowly pulled away from Antigua, Mary gripped the railing tightly while wind struck her face. Daniel grew smaller and smaller beside the shore until eventually he disappeared completely. At that moment, Mary felt something inside her breaking. The ocean stretched endlessly around the ship, while grief swallowed her heart. For days afterward, she barely spoke. The journey across the Atlantic felt endless and frightening. Huge waves crashed violently against the ship during storms while cold winds swept across the deck at night. Mary had never experienced weather like this before. The ocean itself seemed angry. Passengers became sick during rough waters. Sailors shouted constantly while ropes snapped loudly in powerful winds. One night, a terrible storm struck the vessel so violently that Mary feared everyone aboard would die. Thunder exploded across the sky while waves smashed against the ship like mountains of water. People screamed. Objects crashed across the deck. Mary clung desperately to wooden rails while rain soaked her clothes completely. For several terrifying moments she believed the ocean would swallow them all. Then suddenly, another enslaved woman beside her slipped violently across the wet deck. Without hesitation, Mary grabbed the woman's arm just before she crashed into heavy barrels nearby. The frightened woman stared at Mary breathlessly. "Thank you," she whispered shakily. Mary nodded silently, while thunder continued roaring above them. Even surrounded by fear, enslaved people still protected each other. The storm eventually passed, but the emotional exhaustion remained. As days turned into weeks, the air grew colder while the ship traveled farther north. Mary wrapped herself tightly whenever possible because England's cold climate shocked her completely. One morning, sailors announced land was finally near. Passengers rushed eagerly toward the deck. Mary stepped forward carefully and saw grey buildings rising beside the distant shoreline beneath cloudy skies. England. The sight felt strange and overwhelming. Nothing looked like Antigua. Nothing looked like Bermuda. The colours seemed duller. The air felt colder. Even the sea looked darker. When the ship finally arrived in London, Mary stared wide-eyed at the crowded city surrounding her. The streets overflowed with people, horses wagons, smoke, and endless noise. Tall buildings stood close together beneath grey skies while strangers hurried quickly through muddy roads. Mary felt completely overwhelmed. The city looked enormous compared to anything she had ever known. As she followed her owners through crowded streets, she noticed something shocking almost immediately. Black people walking freely, not working under overseers, not carrying heavy loads under threat, simply walking independently through the city. Mary could barely believe her eyes. For the first time in her life, freedom no longer seemed imaginary. The sight awakened dangerous hope inside her chest. Still, reality remained complicated. Though England differed from the Caribbean, Mary still lived under the control of her owners. She continued serving them daily inside their household. She cooked, cleaned, carried supplies, and obeyed commands exactly as before. But emotionally, something had changed. England felt different. People spoke openly about slavery here. Mary overheard conversations in markets and streets discussing abolition. Some churches criticized slavery publicly. Newspapers printed debates about human freedom. The very idea shocked her deeply. In Antigua, questioning slavery openly could bring punishment. Here, people argued about it publicly. One afternoon, while accompanying her owners through the city, Mary overheard two men speaking near a bookstore. "Slavery cannot continue forever," one man insisted firmly. "It disgraces the empire." Mary slowed her steps slightly, while listening carefully. Her heart pounded loudly inside her chest. Could powerful people truly believe slavery was wrong? The possibility felt overwhelming. As weeks passed, Mary became increasingly aware that England operated differently from the Caribbean plantations. Though racism and inequality still existed, enslaved people sometimes gained freedom here through legal or social support. Rumors spread among black communities quietly. Some servants escaped owners successfully. Some abolitionists helped formerly enslaved people survive independently. Mary listened carefully whenever such stories reached her ears. Hope slowly grew stronger inside her, yet fear remained powerful too. If she escaped unsuccessfully, punishment could destroy her completely. Still, another thought haunted her constantly. What if freedom truly stood within reach now? One cold evening, Mary stood beside a window, watching rain fall across London streets. Her reflection stared back at her faintly through the glass. She looked older now, harder. Years of suffering had changed her deeply. But beneath the exhaustion, another version of herself was slowly awakening. A woman beginning to imagine freedom. A woman beginning to question silence. A woman beginning to realize her story mattered. That same evening, her owner spoke sharply after noticing Mary distracted during work. "You belong here," the woman warned coldly. The words struck Mary deeply, because suddenly, they no longer felt completely true. For the first time in her entire life, she secretly imagined another possibility. Maybe she belonged to herself. That dangerous thought changed everything. Days later, Mary encountered free black individuals connected to religious groups and abolitionist communities across London. Some spoke kindly with her during errands around the city. Others quietly shared information about anti-slavery activists helping vulnerable servants. One elderly black woman finally asked Mary a question nobody had ever asked before. "What do you want for your life?" Mary stood speechless. Nobody had ever cared about her desires before. Her entire existence revolved around survival and obedience. Now suddenly, someone asked about her future. That night, Mary barely slept. The question echoed endlessly inside her mind. What did she want? The answer terrified her because it felt impossible and beautiful at the same time. Freedom, real freedom. Not temporary comfort, not survival beneath owners. True freedom. And deep inside her heart, another truth was rising too. If freedom ever came, she would speak honestly about everything she survived. The world needed to know the truth hidden behind Caribbean plantations. The world needed to hear voices slavery tried desperately to silence. Mary did not fully understand it yet, but destiny was moving her toward a future far greater than survival alone. Soon her voice would become stronger than chains, stronger than fear, and powerful enough to challenge an empire itself. London remained cold and heavy, as if the sky itself never fully trusted the earth beneath it. Grey clouds hung over the city most days, and rain came without warning, soaking the streets and turning paths into thick mud. Mary Prince walked through this strange new world with quiet confusion, still carrying the weight of Antigua inside her body and the memories of Bermuda buried deep in her heart. Every step she took in England reminded her that she was far from everything she once knew. But something else was changing too. For the first time in her life, Mary was seeing a world where slavery was not always spoken about in whispers. It was not hidden in complete silence like in the Caribbean. Here, people argued about it in public. They debated it in newspapers. They spoke about it in churches and meetings, as if it was something that could be questioned, challenged, and maybe even changed. That idea alone made Mary's heart beat differently. Still, she remained in service to her owners. She cooked their food, cleaned their rooms, followed their instructions, and moved carefully through their household, as she had done for many years. Outwardly, her life had not changed much, but inside her, something powerful was beginning to grow. Awareness. Mary noticed black people walking freely in the streets of London. Some worked for themselves. Some spoke openly with others. Some moved without fear of overseers. At first, she found it hard to believe what she was seeing. In Antigua, black people walking freely like that would have been almost unthinkable. One afternoon, while running errands, Mary paused near a small group gathered outside a shop. A man was speaking loudly, holding a paper in his hand. People around him were listening carefully. "Slavery is not natural," the man said. "It is not just. It must end." Mary stood still. Those words entered her mind like a strange wind. Must end. In Antigua, no one spoke like that openly. In Bermuda, such words would have been dangerous. But here, in this cold city, people spoke as if change was possible. That night, Mary could not sleep. She lay awake thinking about everything she had heard. The salt fields, the burning sun, the collapsing workers, the mothers crying for children taken away. Daniel's face disappearing slowly into the distance as the ship left Antigua. Everything came back at once, and now something inside her began to shift. Days passed slowly. Mary continued her duties, but she became more observant. She listened more carefully to conversations in the streets. She noticed pamphlets being handed out. She saw groups of people meeting in churches to discuss slavery openly. One evening, while returning from an errand, Mary was stopped by a woman near a narrow street corner. The woman was black, older, and dressed simply. Her eyes carried both kindness and strength. "You look troubled," the woman said softly. Mary hesitated. "I'm just tired," she answered. The woman nodded slowly, as if she understood more than what was spoken. "Tired can mean many things," she replied. "Sometimes it is the body. Sometimes it is the soul." Mary said nothing. The woman studied her for a moment before speaking again. There are people here who listen to stories like yours. Mary frowned slightly. My story? Yes, the woman said. The story of those who lived through slavery. The truth of what it does to human life. Mary felt a strange tension inside her chest. No one had ever asked her to speak about her life in that way before. The woman continued gently. Your voice matters more than you think. Mary looked away. I am just a servant, she whispered. The woman shook her head firmly. No, you are a witness. That word stayed in Mary's mind long after they parted ways. Witness. She did not fully understand it yet, but it felt important. A few days later, Mary heard more about groups in England who were working against slavery. They were collecting stories from people who had experienced it directly. They wanted to show the world what slavery truly was, not what plantation owners claimed it to be. Mary listened carefully whenever she heard these discussions. Something inside her began to stir more strongly each time. One evening, she found herself alone near a window in the house where she worked. Rain tapped softly against the glass, while the city outside moved in blurred motion. She stared at her reflection. For a long time, she simply watched herself. Then slowly, memories began to rise. Her mother crying, the wagon moving away, the salt fields burning under the sun. Daniel standing alone on the shore in Antigua. Her hands tightened. A question formed in her mind that she had never allowed herself to fully ask before. What if all of this was not meant to stay hidden? What if someone needed to hear it, not as gossip, not as rumor, but as truth? The idea frightened her, because speaking truth meant risk, but silence had already cost her so much. The next turning point came unexpectedly. One afternoon, while Mary was out performing her duties, she met a man connected to abolitionist circles. He spoke politely and asked simple questions at first, about her work, her life, her journey. Mary answered carefully, unsure of his intentions, but the man listened differently from others. He did not interrupt. He did not dismiss her. He wrote notes quietly as she spoke. At one point, he paused and looked directly at her. Have you ever told your story fully? He asked. Mary shook her head. No one asks. The man's expression changed slightly. That is exactly why it must be told. Mary felt uneasy. I do not know how, she admitted. You only need to speak, he said gently. The words are already inside you. After that meeting, Mary could not stop thinking. That night, she barely slept again. Her mind replayed fragments of her life in pieces she had long tried to bury. Painful pieces, but also important ones. She began to realize something she had never fully understood before. Her memories were not only her suffering. They were evidence of a system that treated human beings as property, evidence of pain that many people in England had never seen with their own eyes, evidence that could change minds. Still, fear held her tightly. What if they did not believe her? What if speaking brought punishment? What if she lost the little safety she had in England? But another voice inside her grew stronger. What if staying silent meant protecting the system that hurt her and so many others? That question would not leave her alone. Days turned into weeks. Mary continued her work, but inside she was changing. She became more thoughtful, more aware, more restless. It was as if years of silence were pressing against the walls of her mind, demanding to come out. One evening, she met the same woman again, the one who had called her a witness. The woman smiled when she saw Mary. You are still thinking, she said softly. Mary nodded slowly. I cannot stop. The woman's expression softened. That is because your truth is ready. Mary looked down. What if it is too painful? The woman stepped closer. Pain does not erase truth. It strengthens it. Mary stayed silent for a long time. Then finally she asked the question that had been growing inside her for days. If I speak, who will listen? The woman answered without hesitation. Many will listen, and those who do not will still feel it. That night, something changed inside Mary Prince. Not suddenly, not loudly, but deeply. She understood that her life was not only something she survived, it was something that could be shared, something that could reach beyond her own pain, something that could challenge silence itself. Still, she had not yet decided fully, but the path was forming, slowly, carefully, unstoppably, and soon Mary Prince would take a step that would turn her suffering into history, and her voice into a weapon powerful enough to shake the world that once refused to hear her at all. London in the winter felt like a living thing that refused comfort. The wind cut through narrow streets, the rain returned without warning, and the sky stayed heavy as if it carried secrets it never wanted to release. Mary Prince moved through this cold world with a growing weight inside her chest, not only from the weather, but from something far deeper that had begun to take shape in her life. Her story was no longer only memory. It was becoming something else, something that wanted to be spoken, something that refused silence. Each day Mary continued her duties in the household, but her mind was no longer fully inside the walls of service. She still cleaned, cooked, and obeyed commands. Yet inside she was replaying her life again and again. Bermuda, Antigua, the salt fields, the endless sun, the pain that lived in her bones, the faces of people she had lost, the moments she had survived when she thought she would not survive at all. Everything was pressing together like a storm gathering strength. One afternoon, Mary was called unexpectedly to meet a group of men connected to the anti-slavery movement. She entered a quiet room where several people sat waiting with papers, pens, and serious expressions. There was no shouting, no fear in the air, only attention. That alone felt strange to her. In slavery, attention usually meant danger. Here it meant listening. A man spoke gently to her. "We understand you have lived through slavery in the Caribbean." Mary nodded carefully. "Yes." Another man leaned forward slightly. "Would you be willing to describe your experiences?" Mary hesitated. The room felt too quiet, too open, too unfamiliar. She had spent most of her life learning how to stay silent in order to survive. Now she was being asked to do the opposite. Speak. She looked down at her hands. They were rough, scarred, and tired from years of labor. Her voice came softly. "I do not know how to tell it properly." The man replied calmly, "You do not need to make it perfect. You only need to tell the truth." Truth. That word again. It followed her everywhere now. Mary closed her eyes for a moment, and slowly she began to speak. At first, her words were uncertain. She spoke about Bermuda, about her childhood, about being taken from her family. Her voice trembled slightly, but no one interrupted her. No one told her to stop. They simply listened. As she continued, something changed inside her. The memories did not feel like they were only hurting her anymore. They were being carried outward, shared, witnessed. She spoke about Antigua next. The salt fields, the heat that burned like fire on skin, the endless labor, the women collapsing from exhaustion, the punishment that followed weakness, the sickness that never left her body. The room remained silent, but it was not empty silence. It was heavy with attention. Mary continued. She spoke about Daniel, about love formed in a place where love was not supposed to exist, about separation, about loss, about the ship that carried her away from everything she had begun to hope for. Her voice broke slightly at that moment, but still she continued. When she finished speaking, she did not immediately look up. She was afraid of what she might see: judgment, disbelief, or worse, indifference. But instead, she heard a voice speak gently. "Thank you." Another voice followed. "This must be recorded." Mary slowly lifted her eyes. The men were writing carefully on paper. Her life, her suffering, her memories, being written down. For a long time, she did not speak again. She had never seen her life treated this way before. Not as rumor, not as property, but as something that mattered. Days later, Mary was asked to return and continue her account. Each time she spoke, more details came out. Not because she wanted to relive pain, but because the memories had been buried so deeply that speaking was the only way they could surface fully. Each session left her exhausted, but something inside her was also becoming clearer. Her story was not only about her, it was about many others who could not speak. One evening, after returning home, Mary sat alone near a small window. Outside, London lights flickered faintly through fog. She could hear distant footsteps, carriage wheels, and the sound of life moving forward in a city that never seemed to rest. Inside her, everything felt different now. She thought about what had been written down. She thought about how strangers had listened. She thought about how her suffering had been transformed into words that others could read. And she realized something powerful. If her story could be written, it could travel. If it could travel, it could reach people she would never meet. If it reached them, it could challenge what they believed about slavery. That thought frightened her, but it also gave her strength, because for the first time, her pain was not only locked inside her body, it was becoming a voice. The process continued over many days. Mary returned again and again, each time revealing more of her life. Sometimes she spoke with calm strength. Other times, her voice shook as memories became too heavy to hold back. But always, she continued. One of the men writing her account once asked her softly, "Do you ever feel afraid speaking of these things?" Mary answered honestly, "Yes." He looked up from his notes. "Then why continue?" Mary paused for a long moment, because the answer was not simple. Finally, she said, "Because silence did not protect me." Those words stayed in the room for a long time after she spoke them. As winter moved slowly through London, Mary's account began taking shape in written form. She did not fully understand how books worked in detail, but she understood that her words were being organized, preserved, and prepared for others to read. That reality carried both fear and power. Fear because her life was being exposed. Power because her life would no longer disappear into silence. One afternoon, she was shown parts of what had been written. Seeing her experiences turned into structured words on paper made her feel strange. It was as if her suffering had been lifted out of her body and placed into something permanent. She read quietly. Each sentence carried weight. Each memory felt both painful and real. When she finished, she did not speak for a long time. Finally, she said softly, "This is my life." The writer nodded. "Yes." Mary looked down again. "And people will read it." "They will." A long silence followed. Then Mary asked the question that mattered most to her. "Will they understand?" The writer hesitated slightly before answering. "They will not all understand, but many will." Mary accepted that truth slowly. Not everyone would listen. Not everyone would believe. But some would, and that was enough to begin change. As the writing continued, Mary's confidence slowly grew. She still felt fear, but she also felt something new developing inside her. She was no longer only surviving day by day. She was contributing to something larger than herself. Still, memories of Daniel remained painful. Sometimes at night, she would think of Antigua and feel an emptiness she could not explain. Love had not disappeared from her heart. It had simply become part of her grief. Yet even that grief now had meaning, because it shaped her truth. One evening, as she left another meeting, she stepped into the cold London air and looked up at the grey sky. Her breath formed briefly in front of her before fading away. For a moment, she thought about how her voice had once been trapped inside silence for so many years. Now it was being carried outward, not loudly, not instantly, but steadily, and she understood something she had never understood before. Her life was no longer only about what was done to her. It was about what she chose to reveal, and that choice was becoming stronger each day. Somewhere in the distance, change was beginning to move through the world, slowly, uncertainly, but undeniably, and Mary Prince, once a silent child in Bermuda, was now becoming one of its most powerful witnesses. London had no mercy for time. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, and the city kept moving forward under its endless grey sky, as if nothing inside it ever truly stopped to remember pain. But for Mary Prince, something had changed permanently. She was no longer only a servant moving quietly through a household. She was no longer only a woman trying to survive another day. She had become something the world had never expected her to become. A witness whose life was being written down. A voice that could not be buried again. Inside the rooms where her story was recorded, Mary now spoke with a strange mixture of fear and strength. Fear because every memory brought her back to places she never wanted to return. Strength because she finally understood that her suffering was not meaningless anymore. It had a purpose beyond her own survival. Each time she sat down to speak, she felt the weight of her entire life pressing against her chest. Bermuda rose first, soft and painful, like a distant dream she had been torn from too early. She spoke about her mother, about being taken away, about the sound of her mother's voice fading into distance that could never be crossed again. Her voice always softened at that point. Even now, after everything, that wound had never closed. Then came Antigua again. The salt fields returned like fire inside her memory. She spoke about the burning ground, the endless labor, the way exhaustion became part of every breath she took. She spoke about workers collapsing beside her, about sickness that never left the body, about punishment that waited for anyone who slowed down. Every word carried weight. Every sentence felt like pulling truth out of buried pain. The men writing her account listened carefully, sometimes pausing their pens when her voice trembled. They no longer saw her as only a servant. They saw her as something far more important, a living record of slavery. One afternoon, after a long session of speaking, Mary sat alone in the quiet room. The writers had left temporarily, and silence filled the space. She looked down at her hands again, the same hands that had carried salt, carried water, carried pain for most of her life. Now those hands felt different, not free, but changed. She thought about Daniel again. The memory came softly, without warning. His voice, his kindness, the night sky in Antigua, the shell he gave her, the way he believed she deserved freedom, even when the world said otherwise. A quiet sadness moved through her chest. But it was no longer only sadness. It was also memory with a meaning. Footsteps returned in the hallway, and the writers came back into the room. One of them placed a finished draft in front of her. "This is your story," he said gently. Mary looked at the pages. Her life, shaped into words. For a long moment she did not touch it. Then slowly she reached out and held it. As she read, she saw herself reflected in ways she had never seen before, not as property, not as silence, but as a person whose life carried truth powerful enough to reach beyond her own suffering. When she finished reading, she spoke quietly. "If people read this, will they know what slavery truly is?" The writer answered honestly, "They will know more than they ever knew before." Mary nodded slowly. That answer was enough. The publication of her narrative brought change that Mary could not fully witness all at once. Her story began spreading among people who questioned slavery. Some were shocked, some were moved, some refused to believe it, but none could ignore it completely, because her voice carried something undeniable. Reality, not rumor, not fiction. Reality lived through lived experience. In homes across England, people read about a woman who had survived Bermuda, Antigua, and everything in between. They read about salt fields and separation. They read about illness and exhaustion. They read about a life that slavery tried to erase but failed to silence completely. Mary did not see all of this happening at once, but she felt its echo. For the first time, her suffering was no longer locked inside isolated memory. It was moving outward into the world. Still, Mary's life remained difficult. Freedom in England was not simple or complete. She still worked. She still depended on others. She still faced limitations and uncertainty. But something fundamental had changed inside her. She was no longer invisible. One evening, she stood near a window looking out at London streets. The rain had stopped, leaving wet stone shining faintly under dim light. People walked quickly past each other, wrapped in coats, moving through their own lives. Mary watched them quietly. She thought about how far she had come, from a child in Bermuda, to a worker in Antigua's burning salt fields, to a woman whose voice now lived on paper, traveling farther than she ever could. She whispered softly to herself, "I have spoken." And for the first time, those words did not feel small. They felt like truth reaching beyond chains. The world would continue debating slavery. Systems would take time to change. Many struggles would remain long after her voice first entered public awareness. But something irreversible had already happened. Silence had been broken, not by power, not by wealth, but by memory carried through courage. Mary Prince's life became part of something larger than herself. Her testimony stood as evidence that enslaved people were not silent, not invisible, and not without truth. They had always seen, always remembered, always endured, and now, at last, the world was forced to listen. As Mary stood by the window that night, she felt no grand celebration inside her heart. There was only quiet understanding. Her life had not been easy. It had not been fair. But it had mattered. And somewhere far beyond London, beyond oceans and plantations, beyond the places where she had suffered and survived, her voice continued moving forward. Not as a whisper anymore, but as a witness that history could never fully erase again. Welcome to Voices from a Forgotten Soul. Tell us where you are watching from, your city and country. If you have not subscribed yet, please subscribe and like this video for more powerful, true stories from history. Share your experience if you have ever faced anything similar, or what you learned from Mary Prince's journey. Stay glued for our next video.